Snow swallowed the horizon before I understood how far I'd wandered from the column. One moment, the trail stretched clear behind us. The next, it vanished beneath a storm that moved like a living thing. I pushed forward anyway, boots sinking past the ankles, each step heavier than the last. Wind tore at my coat, slipping its fingers inside the seams, and I felt the cold climb my arms, the way water creeps through cracked wood. Nothing stayed warm long out there, not breath, not hope, not the hands I kept clenching and unclenching, trying to feel something other than the burning numbness spreading through them. A shape staggered ahead of me, barely more than a shadow thrashing against the gale. I recognized the hunch of the shoulders, the frantic movements, one of ours rubbing his palms together in sharp, desperate bursts. I tried to shout, but the storm swallowed the sound before it reached him. My voice felt thin, brittle, like my lungs were exhaling frost instead of air. By the time I reached him, his fingers were pale as wax, and panic had carved lines deep across his face. No time to argue, no time to think, only forward. The ground pitched under my feet as another gust struck, and I dropped to one knee, snow filling my collar and melting against my skin like it wanted to claim me from the inside first. I forced myself up again, blinking through the stinging blur, and that's when I saw it. An ember glowing inside a shallow cut in the snow. Just a flicker, just a tremble of orange against the white. But it meant shelter. It meant someone had survived long enough to make it. I moved toward it, hand pressed to my chest, trying to feel the warmth I was quickly losing as the wind kept rising. Nothing prepared me for how fast the cold could think. Out there, it didn't strike like a bullet or roar like artillery. It crept, it watched, it waited for the moment a glove slipped or a bootlace loosened, then slid into the opening with the patience of something ancient. I felt it studying me as I pushed toward that ember buried in the drift. The wind sharpened, carving along my cheekbones, each gust stealing another layer of warmth I couldn't spare. Snow rode the air sideways, biting at any exposed skin with the precision of ground glass. I kept moving, because stopping meant sinking, and sinking meant the cold would finish what it had already begun inside my fingers. My squadmate stumbled beside me, clutching his hands beneath his arms, rocking as if motion alone might save him. His breaths turned to crystals before his mouth, the shapes breaking apart in the violent air. Fear had hollowed him out, turning each step into a question he didn't want answered. I reached for his shoulder, steadying him, though my own balance felt as fragile as that trembling ember ahead of us. We didn't talk. The storm made speaking pointless, and besides, what could we say that the cold hadn't already whispered louder? Past the drift, the trench revealed, itself only in pieces. First a dark seam in the snow, then a broken timber, then finally a human shape crouched low near the ember's glow. A veteran from our unit, unmistakable even through the blur of frozen lashes. He beckoned us down, urgency etched into every gesture. We slid toward him, half falling, half guided, letting the trench swallow us before the storm made a final claim. The cold didn't follow inside, but its silence did, pressing close enough to remind us what waited just beyond the rim. Inside that narrow trench, the wind softened to a muted hiss, like it was waiting just beyond the lip for permission to resume the hunt. Shadows clung to the snow-packed walls, and the ember near the veteran's boots cast a trembling orange pulse across his face. I could finally see him clearly. Ice threaded through his beard, frost clinging to the seams of his coat, eyes sharp with the kind of knowledge earned only by surviving nights that should have ended differently. He didn't waste time with questions. He scanned our hands, our faces, the way our shoulders slumped with exhaustion, and his expression tightened with recognition. We weren't the first he'd pulled out of the white. During those winters, the Eastern Front swallowed men faster than any offensive. Frostbite took rifles out of hands long before battle did, and commanders wrote casualty numbers that didn't distinguish between bullets and cold. I'd heard whispers before, the kind spoken low during marches, stories of entire units crippled by temperatures that dropped below anything a body could argue with. They said some nights froze canteens solid in minutes, froze breath to scarves, froze resolve into something brittle enough to snap before dawn. We were living one of those nights, and the trench felt less like shelter and more like a pause granted by whatever ruled the snowfields. Breathing steadied slowly. My fingers throbbed with that dull, distant ache that meant danger hadn't passed, only paused. Across from me, my squad mate cradled his hands like something precious he feared he might lose. The veteran crouched closer to the ember, feeding it a shaving of wood no thicker than a matchstick, careful not to let the flame rise too high. We watched that glow, knowing warmth alone couldn't save us, but understanding we needed its light all the same. Heat never lingered long in places like that. Even inside the trench, the air felt thin, worn out, as if countless desperate breaths had already passed through it before ours. I tried flexing my fingers again, hoping the pain meant something was waking beneath the numbness, but all I felt was a stiff, distant pulse, one that didn't belong to me so much as echo through the bones. Across from me, my squad mate pulled off a glove with trembling hands. The sight made my stomach tighten. His skin had taken on a grayish cast, mottled where blood had retreated too far. He rubbed at it in frantic circles, believing friction might summon warmth, but every motion scraped away what little feeling remained. The veteran reached out and caught his wrist, stopping him with a firmness that left no space for argument. Nothing in his face softened. Nothing in his eyes suggested panic. He'd seen worse countless times, and the memory lived in the way he moved, slowly, deliberately, as if quick actions belonged only to the cold. He rummaged through his pack, pulling free a scrap of cloth stiff with frost, laying it near the ember where the warmth could ease its rigidity. Silence settled around us again, thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of the storm scraping its nails along the trench walls above us. I watched flakes drift down through the cracks, each one turning translucent as it neared the faint glow. It struck me then how fragile we were. 3 men crouched beneath a sky that had no mercy to offer. Strength felt like a myth in that moment. Endurance felt like a negotiation. My breath came shallow as the cold gnawed at my boots, threatening to climb higher with each passing minute. Yet beneath all that fear, something else stirred, faint but insistent, as if the night itself expected us to learn a truth we hadn't yet earned. Nothing in the veteran's posture hinted at hesitation as he unfolded the stiff cloth he'd warmed by the ember. A fragment of a field manual hid inside it, edges curled from damp and time, the ink smudged where frost had seeped through. He held it like an artifact dug from the ice, something salvaged from men who'd already learned the hard way what we were just beginning to understand. I leaned closer, drawn by a mixture of dread and need, watching his gloved thumb press down on a line that had survived the weather better than the men who once relied on it. Slow rewarming, it read. Never flame, never friction, always skin. Understanding didn't come at first. Desperation made strange suggestions when a body hovered at the edge of frostbite, but the notion of using another person's warmth felt primitive, almost foolish, like something spoken in the dark before better knowledge arrived. I glanced at my own hands, the fingers stiffening despite the shelter, the skin paling toward the dangerous white I'd seen on others who never recovered full use. The veteran noticed, tugging his coat aside to reveal the space beneath his arm, a cradle of warmth hidden beneath layers that smelled of smoke and frozen earth. He extended it without ceremony, expecting me to know what needed to be done. Reluctance flickered, not from pride but disbelief. Still, instinct overruled doubt. I pressed my frozen fingers against his skin, the contact shocking in its gentleness. A numb ache spread first, then a subtle stirring, like sparks searching for tinder. Pins and needles chased each other along my knuckles, a pain sharp enough to promise life. My breath caught, not from discomfort, but recognition of something older than the war itself. In that hollow of shared warmth, the cold's authority cracked, and a forgotten wisdom stirred awake. Warmth didn't return in a rush. It crept, cautious as the cold had been, moving through my fingers in faint pulses that felt almost imagined at first. I held them there beneath the veteran's arm, skin against skin, listening to the shallow rhythm of his breathing as if it might guide my own. Nothing about the moment felt dramatic. It was slow, deliberate, a method older than any doctrine we'd been taught, and the stillness around us deepened while sensation stirred in fragile increments. My fingers tingled, then burned, then settled into a prickling ache that traveled from knuckle to wrist like a hesitant thaw. I bit down on the instinct to pull away. Pain meant the body was waking. Across from us, my squadmate watched with a mix of awe and disbelief. The veteran motioned him closer, opening his coat again, directing him toward the warmth beneath the other arm. He obeyed, lowering his head, as if entering a sanctuary rather than seeking treatment. The ember pulsed behind us, its light flickering across the trench walls, making the snow seem to breathe in soft expansions. For the first time that night, the cold didn't overpower the air. It merely lingered, waiting for an opportunity we refused to give. Minutes stretched, measured by our breaths and the slow revival of circulation. The veteran adjusted our hands occasionally, ensuring the warmth spread evenly, ensuring no part of frozen skin caught sudden heat. Every motion carried intention, an understanding passed down through generations who knew the cold more intimately than soldiers ever would. My fingers gradually flushed with color, faint but promising, each shade a step away from the edge we'd nearly crossed. Somewhere above us, the storm shifted with a muffled groan, but we stayed anchored in that human circle, letting the body relearn what fire could never teach. Stories traveled fast across frozen ground, faster sometimes than orders, faster even than fear. By morning, men from neighboring positions drifted toward our trench, drawn by whispers of a method that sounded too simple to carry weight. They arrived with stiff hands pressed to their chests, faces set in that quiet desperation soldiers learn to hide until someone recognizes it. The veteran didn't raise his voice or preach. He merely stepped aside, letting them witness what human warmth could reclaim. One by one, they crouched near the ember's fading glow, listening as he explained the danger of direct heat, the damage of friction, the fragile balance required to coax blood back into frozen flesh without shattering what remained. No one laughed, though I could sense disbelief curling around the edges of their caution. War made men suspicious of anything that lacked metal or medicine. Yet when they saw my fingers regain their color, saw the hesitance in my movements replaced by tentative strength, something shifted. Pride softened, skepticism quieted. The cold had humbled all of us enough to accept survival in whatever form it arrived. By midday, the practice spread beyond our trench. Medics, already overwhelmed, watched with wary eyes before finally admitting the results spoke louder than protocol. They began encouraging the slower thaw, adjusting their own techniques to mirror what the veteran had shown us. It wasn't an official order, not yet, but lived knowledge rarely waited for permission. The method moved through the ranks like a quiet current, passed hand to hand, whispered during patrols, carried into dugouts where men nursed early signs of frostbite with hope rather than panic. None of us realized we were witnessing the birth of a lesson that would outlast the uniforms we wore, but the cold understood, pausing only long enough to test our resolve again. Science never announced itself in that trench, yet its logic shaped every choice we made. Long after the war, I would learn the language for what we felt happening in our hands, the slow dissolution of ice crystals, the careful return of blood flow, the preservation of tissue spared from the shock of sudden heat. But that night, knowledge came through instinct, through the patient rhythm of another person's warmth guiding mine back from the edge. The body knew its way long before we understood the mechanics. Gradual thawing allowed cells to breathe again. Harsh heat would have ruptured them, turning frozen injury into irreversible loss. Skin, with its steady temperature and living pulse, offered what fire and friction could never replicate. Understanding this gave the moment a weight I didn't expect. We weren't just fighting cold. We were aligning ourselves with a truth that had survived centuries of winter across cultures far older than ours. Arctic herders, mountain guides, indigenous hunters, they had all known the danger of quick fixes. They had learned to trust the body's rhythms, not override them. And there we were, soldiers armed with machinery of war, humbled into following wisdom carried through time by those who'd lived closer to the elements than any commander ever had. My mind drifted as sensation returned fully to my fingers, each pulse of warmth a small triumph. Philosophy threaded through the quiet, uninvited but welcome. Maybe survival had always depended less on strength and more on surrender. Surrender to connection, to patience, to the truth that no one warms alone in a place ruled by frost. Even the ember reflected that lesson, glowing only because someone shielded it from the wind. Above us, the storm settled into a heavy hush, as if conceding the round to something it couldn't quite smother. Years later, when winters no longer dictated whether a man kept his fingers or his life, I found myself remembering that trench more often than the battles that framed it. Memory is strange that way. It doesn't cling to the noise or the chaos. It holds instead to the quiet moments, where something essential shifts. I would feel a sting in my knuckles during the first cold mornings of each season, and the past would rise, not as trauma, but as a reminder of how close I came to losing more than sensation. The lesson traveled with me long after the uniforms were folded away, long after the war's pages yellowed into history. I taught it to my children when they complained about numb hands in winter, explaining not just the method, but the patience behind it, the trust required to let warmth return on its own terms. Modern medicine eventually gave the technique a name, wrapped it in clinical language, studied it under microscopes. Yet none of their explanations carried the gravity of that night when a simple ember and one man's quiet instruction bridged the space between injury and hope. Technology grew sharper over time, tools more precise, treatments more advanced, but winter still demanded respect, and frostbite still bowed first to the oldest remedy we'd ever known: skin to skin, steady warmth, shared endurance. Watching the world lean further into isolation, I sometimes wondered whether the cold that threatened us now was no longer confined to weather. People drifted apart in ways storms could never manage, their distance measured by silence instead of snow. The memory of that trench pressed against those thoughts with its own steady glow. Connection had saved us once. Connection would always matter, even when frost came from places no season could predict. Some truths don't fade. They settle deeper each time the wind turns sharp. Age softened the winters, or maybe it only softened me. Either way, I found myself standing in the quiet of later years, watching snow fall with a calm that would have felt foreign to the younger man who once staggered through a storm believing the cold could think. My hands rested easily in my coat pockets, fingers whole, nerves mostly steady, though an occasional twinge still rose when the temperature dipped sharply enough to remind me of how close I'd come to losing them. That ache never frightened me. It grounded me. It carried the echo of the trench, the ember, the men who gathered around warmth, shared rather than claimed. Time has a way of distilling memory, leaving only what matters. The war blurred at its edges, battles dissolving into muted recollections, but the night we learned to thaw frost-bitten hands with nothing more than patience and human skin remained sharp. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was simple. Endurance rarely announces itself with grandeur. Most often it arrives as a quiet offering, an arm lifted, a coat opened, a space made for another to survive. I had thought strength was something forged in fire. That night taught me it could also be shaped in the hollow beneath someone's arm, where warmth lived steady and unassuming. Even now, when cold winds swept across the fields near my home, I paused to feel their bite, not in fear, but in recognition. The world had changed, grown louder, faster, more insulated by tools and noise, yet the old truth endured beneath it all. Survival begins where one person chooses not to let another freeze. Light didn't always come from flame. Sometimes it rose from the simple act of holding someone close enough to keep them alive. They never lit a fire, yet somehow they became it. If stories like this remind you what endurance really means, subscribe and keep these lessons alive.